We are so happy to have so many of you coming today to our FORO URGENTE on the Brazilian Library, which is something, I think it's something that's touched everybody's heart, to think of a country losing its treasures in a single night, in a single fire. It's something none of us want to think about too much, but there it is. And so this is about the event itself, and it's about things that we can think about doing to protect our own collections and to help out the Brazilian Museum. Other people will say more about what our purpose today is, but I do want to just welcome everyone and explain what a FORO URGENTE is. It's an urgent forum that we like to put on at LLILAS Benson about, it's a rapid response forum on contemporary issues and how we react to that. And we're very lucky to have local specialists who can speak to so many different things, including this particular tragedy. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lorraine Haricombe, who's a Vice Provost of UTL, University of Texas Libraries. She's got a special interest in this as well, and so she's going to give you a greeting.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here also, to help us work through and strategize perhaps in ways that they can help. But I just wanted to say welcome first, and also just assure you that libraries, museums, archives often get together to help each other in crises like this. To us, it's like breathing. It's like oxygen. We don't think about it, we just do it. I like the Nike logo. We just do it, especially right now. The Benson collection in particular in this area is emerging large, looming large globally now because of who we are and what we have and resources potentially to help out. So I'm very, very interested in hearing your presentations today and in the ways that we can help. You know, Winston Churchill, I think, was the person who said, a pessimist is one who sees the difficulty in every opportunity. I hope that we are optimists today to see the opportunity in this crisis. With that, I will turn it over to Professor Garfield.
Thank you very much. As the director of the Brazil Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you. And I also wanted to thank the panelists for participating in today's forum and to give a special thank you to Paloma Diaz for organizing this event. So I'll go ahead and introduce the panelists in the order in which they'll be presenting. We're going to be reflecting on the historical importance of the museum and also ways forward after this terrible tragedy. Patty Epps is a professor in the Department of Linguistics here at UT. Her research interests revolve around descriptive and documentary work on indigenous Amazonian language, typology, language contact, and language change, and the implication of language for studying Amazonian prehistory. Her publications include the monograph, A Grammar of Hoop, as well as articles in leading linguistics journals. She'll be followed by Vivian Flanzer, senior lecturer and the Portuguese language program coordinator and supervisor here at UT, as well as the associate director of the Portuguese flagship program. Her areas of interest include teaching of culture in the foreign language classroom and foreign language education methodologies, and she's also an alumna of the graduate program in social anthropology at the National Museum. Melissa Guy will follow. She's the director of the library, the Benson Library, and she previously served as head of collection development for the Benson. Prior to coming to UT, she was the subject specialist for Latin American and Iberian studies at Arizona State University Libraries. And I'll provide the closing remarks and we'll open it up for discussion. So, Patty Epps.
Okay. So I've prepared a few slides to sort of illustrate some of the things that I'll be talking a little bit about. And I'll just speak very briefly from my perspective as someone who's been involved for many years in the documentation of indigenous languages and cultures, and in working with indigenous communities in thinking about and documenting their heritage. And clearly, Brazil's Museu Nacional represents many, many things. It was a rich and amazing resource in many domains, but one of its greatest treasures, in my opinion at least, was, and I think the opinion of many, was the materials it had on relating to indigenous languages and cultures. So as far as thinking about what was lost, of the collection in the museum, of course, was an immense collection of material objects from indigenous cultures going back for hundreds of years. And many indigenous groups have been going to the museum and learning more about their heritage and being more in touch with their heritage on the basis of through those material artifacts. Another part of the museum was a collection of linguistic materials, so many, many documents and also recordings. And here's a snapshot of an email that went around to a large group of people who were involved in linguistics in Brazil, relating to what was lost. So in English, this person is saying, folks, nothing was saved from linguistics. We lost the entire collection of indigenous languages, recordings since 1958, songs in many languages without living speakers, the Courtney Moindaju archive, papers, photos, negatives, the ethnohistorical linguistic map, the original ethnohistorical linguistic map. So some of this material was digitized, much of it apparently was not, and nobody that I've been in touch with seems to have a very clear idea of exactly how much was digitized. But it's clear that a huge amount was lost, and even, of course, materials that were digitized, the originals are enormously valuable historically and tangibly and so on, and they're gone. So just to kind of give you a taste of what this means, this is Courtney Moindaju, who is actually a German anthropologist who spent most of his life in Brazil living with indigenous communities, documenting their languages and cultures. He took a Tupi-Guarani name, so his original name was not Moindaju. And he ultimately died in an indigenous community in 1945. So he amassed an enormous collection of materials that today are one of the most important historical records of indigenous cultures and languages from Amazonia, from Brazilian Amazonia. One of these things that was mentioned in the email is this map. So on the right is a original hand-drawn version that presumably was lost in the fire. And on the left is a kind of recreated version of that as well. But there are various iterations of this map with historical value. Fortunately, this map was digitized, but again, there's no replacing the original. And it's quite an amazing map. So what he did was localize different communities. There are dates for each of these colored dots relating to the first documentation of the first time that record of these communities or these indigenous groups entered the historical record. There's arrows showing evidence of their migration from place to place, so it's a tremendous contribution that he made. And this is just one part of this large collection of original documents relating to his work that was lost in the fire. Another aspect that I think is important to highlight is the effect of this loss on the indigenous peoples of Brazil. So here's a headline from a news report and a photograph of a Tupinamba man who was involved in, actually this guy is Tarahaguarajara, so Tupi-Guarani people, who was involved in using the resources of the museum to learn more about his culture's heritage and to study that heritage. Here's just a couple of pictures of artifacts that come from that same article, which are now lost. So a Munduruku headdress that was founded, or that was entered the museum's collection in the 1800s. A Tikuna mask that apparently was presented to Dom Pedro I in the 1800s as well. So these things are all gone. Daniela Alarcon, who's an anthropologist who was here as a visiting scholar last year, sent a bunch of materials actually this morning by email. One of the things that she sent is some work that she and her colleagues are doing right now to document the relevance of the loss of the museum to various indigenous peoples, in particular indigenous students who are involved in the anthropology program at the Museu Nacional in Rio. And this is just one page of a whole series of testimonials from these Indigenous students talking about how, what a great loss this is to them personally and culturally, as well as to Brazil and to the rest of the world. So I want to say a little bit from my perspective as, just again very briefly, but say a little bit from my perspective as co-director of the ILA archive here at UT. So digitizing materials that are in physical archives is of paramount importance. And events like this fire tragically call our attention to the importance of this action of digitizing things and how important it is. And again, sadly, there were a great deal of the materials at the museum were not digitized. Why not? I think a number of reasons. So institutional inertia, lack of funding or prioritization of funding going to different things and not digitization. And sadly, apparently in this case, from what I understand from my colleagues in Brazil, there was also part of the fact that this collection of linguistic materials hadn't been digitized also traces back to some internal arguments among scholars in Brazil relating to international affiliations and standards of documentation and archiving that certain people felt were associated with international networks. So it's a long story from what I understand, but apparently that also was relevant. So I think it's just really, really important to stress the importance for everybody to target collections around the world that are not digitized, and for everybody to work together to try to leverage energy and funding to get these collections digitized. And so I think that one positive thing perhaps that could come out of this event is a call to action for people all over the world to create backups, create digital archives of materials that exist in collections. So this is certainly the case for personal collections. So I'm involved right now, for example, in an initiative through ILA to work with a number of anthropologists and linguists who collected materials on indigenous languages and cultures in the 70s, before digitization was even a thing, before digital archiving was even a thing. And we've managed to secure funding from NEH to work with these scholars to digitize their collections and put them in the ILA archive. But this is just a drop in the bucket, and there are so many collections both in the hands of individual scholars and in centralized places like the Museu Nacional that need to be digitized and safeguarded. One other example is the set of materials at Carvi Cuervo in Bogota in Colombia that also is a huge amount, just a treasure trove of materials on indigenous Colombian languages, many of which are no longer even spoken. And my understanding is that those materials are still in hard copy cassette tapes and so forth. And we've been talking with people there, and hopefully there'll be some initiatives getting going to digitize those materials. But hopefully events like the Museu Nacional will spur people to take action and find the funding, even though it's not easy to find. So from the perspective of ILA here, I think it's just important to reiterate the importance of digital archives and the willingness or the importance of being willing for everybody to work together, work with existing archives, build new archives to get materials, to preserve materials for the long term, and to hopefully avoid complete losses like what we see here. This is just a snapshot of the webpage of ILA for those of you who aren't familiar with it, but you can go online, you can look at it, and this is one of a number of archives, but this is the leading archive for languages of Latin America in general. And there is another digital archive run by our colleagues at the Museu do Índio in Rio that is also an excellent initiative, also at the Museu Galgi in Brazil, and in other parts of the world as well. And just finally to end on, this is some material that Daniela Alarcón sent as of this morning, so I assume it's current, relating to ways that we can help the Museu Nacional and assist the initiatives that are ongoing right now to try to get these collections back on their feet and renew the materials that were lost as much as possible. So I know there are a couple of hard copies of this that can be circulated.
Thank you.
I would like to invite the people who just arrived to move now, take the opportunity now to move. We have chairs on this side of the room. And also the materials.
What?
There's one there, one there.
Yeah, no.
And also the materials that Dr. Epps was referring
I'll follow up on
were
that.
posted this morning in the Facebook event page. So please use that page to keep exchanging information and stories about this tragedy.
Hi. So, like everybody else, I'm absolutely devastated about the terrible loss caused by the fire at the Museu Nacional. But as an alumna from that institution, this loss feels also very personal. It was at the Museu Nacional that I became an anthropologist and an academic. So today I'm going to speak more about my personal memories. Being a graduate student at the Museu Nacional was a very unique experience, I would say almost surreal. How many schools do you know where to reach the classroom, one has to climb a steep hill with magnificent gardens and enter this enormous, majestic building that once was entrance exam for the graduate program. So it was a 4-hour written exam in a little room inside the museum. Very competitive exam, everybody's writing like crazy, and I had to go to the bathroom. So I left the room to try to find the bathroom, but next thing you know, I got lost. And I found myself inside these huge rooms full of mummies, and I was all by myself. And I was very scared because of the mummies, but also that I couldn't find my way back to the museum's classroom. And then, I don't know, some dinosaurs here and there. I finally found my way back, and I still think it was a miracle that I passed that exam and finished it on time. But when I say that the experience of being a student in the museum was very unique, I was not really referring to the physical environment, but for me, what made this extraordinary place was the privilege to study with the finest minds in Brazilian academia. The courses we took were super rigorous and very intellectually challenging. The bibliography was gigantic, and we were expected to read every Lévi-Strauss in French, and so Durkheim and Moss, blah, 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 and in English, Spanish, and of course, Portuguese. The professors took their courses very, very seriously, and the discussions were very illuminating. And I always say that I learned to think at the Museu Nacional because these courses, they shaped my mind and they reflect everything I do today in academia and in the classroom with my students. Yet my professors, they also published widely in academic books and articles in prestigious national and international journals, but also they were very, very devoted social activists, using their research and their talents to give voice to minority communities in Brazil. It's extraordinary. And yet, with all their brilliance, their fame, their busy lives, they also found time to invest in their students' research, projects, and show interest in our personal lives. The strong bonds we created lasted forever. I still correspond with my advisor, João Pacheco de Oliveira, and I visited my super beloved linguistic professors to whom I was very close, Ione Leite, who, by the way, got her PhD in linguistics here at UT in 1974. So I visited her every year until she passed away in 2014. The fire destroyed most of the museum's collection, but it did not burn one of the museum's best assets, the brilliant minds of its faculty and the community of their students. So I believe it will be just a matter of time for the graduate program to be shining again.
Hi everyone. I'm speaking today really from an institutional standpoint, and as the director of a major collection of Latin American materials, but also as someone who has studied Brazil, loves Brazil, has spent a lot of time in Rio. So there's a personal piece to it, and like everyone, my first reaction when I learned of the fire was one of heartbreak. There wasn't much else to feel at the moment, knowing that the loss would be profound, and indeed it was. And I feel such sadness for all of Brazil, and particularly for the researchers and those who have worked at the museum, who have dedicated their lives to, in the context of the resources that they have, to safeguarding and promoting Brazilian cultural heritage, and in this case particularly indigenous languages and cultures. And in all honesty, the sadness was followed by anger, some anger at realizing that such a major cultural institution was left so vulnerable. I mean, I think a lot of us have a lot of mixed emotions about this, and now we're in a space of trying to figure out how we go forward, and that's why we're here. Those of us who work in cultural heritage spaces realizes that this event has raised so many questions, and when we don't have all the answers yet, but we have to ask them. And so my remarks today are going to focus on some of those questions and lead us perhaps in some directions, but I hope that the questions might spark some of the conversation after the panel. First, of course, we know, the question was, could this tragedy have been prevented? And sadly, the answer is probably yes. If decisions had been made, both political and administrative, financial, in the immediate aftermath of the fire, of course, we know there was a lot of finger pointing, and I think some of that is still going on. That's only productive to a certain point. At some point you have to see what's going to happen next. And so, of course, the next question is, what does that mean for going forward? And will this change the way resources are allocated to cultural institutions in Brazil and elsewhere? Those of us who devote our lives to this kind of work hope this will be a wake-up call, as Patty has said, and whether that will be the case, of course, remains to be seen. And we can play a role in that in our own neck of the woods. And by saying that, I want to emphasize that the situation in Brazil is certainly high profile, but it's not necessarily unique, in that many cultural heritage institutions around the world, including in the United States, suffer from lack of infrastructure and investment in basic operations, including staff. Budgets have been and continue to be slashed, pushing administrations to look for private funding for public institutions. And this strategy especially puts critical infrastructure at risk. I recently read an op-ed in the LA Times written by somebody who I think works at Occidental College and was involved in building some of their natural history resources there. And he made the remark that in the United States and perhaps around the world, donors don't necessarily want to slap their names on sprinkler systems. And that's his quote in the LA Times, so you can find it, and there's some truth to that. So it's about how we go about funding what's sexy or what's not sexy about institutions, and at the end of the day, we have to be able to protect them. And then, of course, full disclosure, as somebody who's the director of a major collection that has priceless materials in it, I immediately had to ask myself, what was the state of emergency preparedness in my own institution, right? And it just so happened that I had a meeting the next morning with UT Library's Assistant Director of Stewardship, Wendy Martin, who's here, and she's in charge of preservation and emergency preparedness for UT Libraries, including the Benson. And I sat down next to her and said, Wendy, how good is my fire suppression system? I don't think I've ever asked that question before. And so I hope those kinds of questions are taking place around the world. And of course, Wendy told me, yes, we have one, and yes, it works. And I said, thank you for making sure I know that. And I also want to point out that Wendy will be available for the Q&A if there are specific questions about how we do emergency preparedness, or what institutions like the Museu Nacional might do in this regard. And also on hand, if I can call attention to Olivia Permanis, who is in charge of conservation efforts at the Harry Ransom Center. And yes, but also, Olivia, correct me if I'm wrong, you have direct experience helping institutions recover from fires, no? So if there are specific questions about how, what's possible after a fire, depending on the degree, Olivia and Wendy might be able to help with questions in that regard, and we're very glad you're here. But if we move back to, sort of institutional questions about where we go, the tragedy in Brazil also brings to the forefront difficult questions about how the fire will or will not change the way collections are built around the world. What will this mean in terms of safeguarding cultural patrimony in its place of origin? A more blunt way of putting this is, will the disaster result in an increased push for private collections to leave Brazil and other countries in the so-called global south toward institutions in the north? Clearly, the Benson is smack dab in the middle of this conversation, and we fully acknowledge that, and we look forward to engaging in these conversations because they're too important not to have. The Benson, because of its international reputation, regularly gets offers from private collectors who want to donate or sell their collections to this institution, and more times than I can count, the rationale from the person who wants their collection to end up here touches on fears, ill-conceived or not, that somehow their collections will not be safeguarded in their place of origin for either political or economic or other reasons. Those are things we grapple with all the time, and I have a sense that those conversations will be more frequent, and I can say that from the perspective of Benson leadership, it doesn't change the way we approach cultural patrimony and how we understand that the best thing for most collections is for them to remain in their country of origin. And so we're not necessarily going to change our approach, but we do have mechanisms in place that can get us to a space that works for all parties. And in that regard, I'll point to our post-custodial archival work. Although going back to questions about cultural patrimony, the other thing we want to watch for is, will this change, or how will it have an impact on laws that are passed in Latin America and around the world about cultural patrimony and what's to be done with cultural heritage materials. We've seen an uptake in the laws on that in Latin America in the last 5-10 years already, and so I'll be interested to see if we see an additional push for certain legislation in that area. Certainly all of this underscores the importance of the post-custodial work we do at LLILAS Benson, in which we safeguard at-risk materials by preserving and hosting digital copies at UT, leaving their originals in their country of origin, and our partnership with the Guatemalan National Police Historical Archive, or the AHPN, is the most high-profile example of this work. And we have many others, and we will continue to work in this vein. That said, this particular approach cannot be a solution for lack of investment in cultural heritage institutions. We can't have one without the other. It has to go together. And then finally, the question is, what can we do to help? If we want to look at this as an opportunity in the face of disaster, what can LLILAS Benson do to help the Museu Nacional? As we have noted, the harsh truth is that much of the loss is real and permanent. That's just a fact. We also have to note that the Museo is in many respects a very different kind of collection, with its emphasis on natural history and specimens. The Benson is very much an academic library with an archive that focuses on manuscript. That said, we are paying close attention to the conversation surrounding the anthropology and indigenous language library materials, and we are aware of calls to send books that might replicate holdings that were lost, including the documentation that Patty referred to that was sent to us by a former LLILAS student. We're watching those, and we fully intend to engage with the community that is trying to rebuild the Museo. Specifically, we are in communication with the director of the Library of Congress field office in Rio, Pamela Howard, who's sort of helping us get a sense of where things stand from a library perspective on the ground. And the latest message I've received from her is the Library of Congress field office in Rio has offered to be a housing space for folks who want to send duplicates, and so that would then build the Museo's collections, and the Benson will probably work through that channel because we're used to working with the Library of Congress field office. But what she has said for the moment is that while everyone wants to help now, there's some situations that they have to get a handle on, meaning that they don't have a lot of places to put them. That they're, and maybe Seth, you might have some updates about this, but that the Museu Nacional is administered by the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro, and that institution is trying to find locations where they could store things.